So let's talk about Kubernetes and de-Googling it. This is not bashing Google. I want to make that absolutely plain. If Google hadn't have open sourced Kubernetes in the first place, none of us would be able to adopt it. We wouldn't be able to have a play with it. It must have given them a massive competitive advantage to have this at their scale in their organization, and that they chose to let everyone else play. In fact, they even donated it to the foundation, so they didn't even have complete control over its future. That's generosity. I'm old enough to remember the Novell Microsoft platform wars of the early 90s, where those two companies were trying to kill each other for the battle of servers and platforms. It's such a different world we're in today. It's fantastic. Kubernetes came from Google, and in the wider community is gradually evolving Kubernetes so it works for the rest of us just as well as it works for Google. And they're doing it at quite a pace. Every Kubernetes release is only supported for 9 months. That's something else you need to be aware of with Kubernetes. I haven't got a slide for it, but if you're an organization that's not used to constantly upgrading your infrastructure, you celebrate uptimes of years, for example, which you should never bloody do anyway, but that's a different story. Again, Kubernetes is going to challenge you. You've got to upgrade early, upgrade often, which you should always do with open source. But with Kubernetes, you've got no choice, because after 9 months, you've got no updates. I've been working on it for 6 months, and there's been 3 major releases in those 6 months. Certainly 2, there may have been 3. So it moves at quite a pace. So this is good. But you need to know about the Google bubble, because you are going to run into some issues. Obviously at Google, they're not running stuff on Minikube for production. They're not running stuff like we're going to do. I mean, 6 nodes for us will run most of our workloads, most of our systems, even no matter how badly written they are. When I first got into Docker, for example, I worked on a government system that was doing over £1 million a week in transactions. That ran on my Ultrabook quite happily, and that was considered a large government project at the time. The UK, we don't have a lot of opportunities to do things really at scale, and certainly not Google scale. They have got so many of these things, so many that I thought I was going to crash Keynote when I put that slide together. There's hundreds of the bugly things on there. I mean, I think they've got clusters. I think they talk about clusters in terms of tens of thousands of nodes, for example. Yeah. I live near Cardiff. There's not even 10,000 people working software in Cardiff. According to the government figures, there's like 4,500. Cardiff's small, but they've got more nodes than we've got people in Cardiff who work on development stuff, for example. And one of the things I was taught when I did my software engineering degree back in the early 90s is problems change with volume and scale. Our problems are not their problems, but it also works the other way around. Google has to solve problems we don't have, and we will never have. So the way they've done some of the design decisions they've made for Kubernetes, and you're going to interact with these design decisions if you adopt Kubernetes, are things that work for them and don't work for us. And as a result, some of the things in Kubernetes are still need to evolve to help us. One example is the event log in Kubernetes. I've mentioned that there is conceptually an event stream coming out of the API saying what's happened. You can access a snapshot of that via what's called the event log, again conceptually. Now, most of you who looked at log files are used to them being time ordered, and every message is in that log file, so you can do detailed forensics to understand what's gone on and why, assuming your log messages are up to snuff. This event log, they are not ordered. Not every event is in the log in the first place, and they roll everything up. And even on Minikube, you quickly get, when you're trying to troubleshoot, so you put a deployment onto Minikube, it doesn't work. And even on Minikube, when nothing else is happening and you're trying to track down why, you will soon start to have trouble figuring out what's gone wrong, because the event log is not helpful to you enough of the time. Sometimes it's helpful, depends, but it's all random which order it's in. Or it might as well be. So that's one thing with that.
So how would Google troubleshoot that?
Well, if you go into, well, actually, I'll talk about that a bit more in a moment because I've got a couple of slides on that. Another thing with Google is they don't run other people's software. You know, they've got whole armies of developers cranking out software to their designs and their specifications. So on Kubernetes, they're running software that's designed specifically to work with how Kubernetes was when it was inside Google. But a lot of us are running third-party containers, for example. You know, Docker Hub's full of them, and it's a big time saver. But a lot of those third-party containers don't run out the box on Kubernetes. The example with that is file systems. I've mentioned you attach file systems. And once a file system is created, you've still got to set who owns it, who can write to it. Kubernetes doesn't have that bit. It's not there in Kubernetes. Or more accurately, you can say which group can write to the file system, but when you run a container, it runs as a user. In fact, there's a user command in Docker files to say which user to run it as. And you can't say, there's no equivalent in Kubernetes to say this container is going to run as this user ID, so please make sure they've got write access to the file system. There's workarounds for it, but Kubernetes out of the box doesn't give you support for that. And they waste a lot of time on that. So if you go, and this is aimed at answering your question as well. So once you start running into these problems, you go to the Kubernetes documentation. And the Kubernetes documentation tells you what's there, but it doesn't tell you what's not there, of course. And you may end up on Stack Overflow, but hopefully you're better than that. And instead, you end up in the Kubernetes bug tracker, where people are going, this feature seems to be missing. Can you please add it? But you won't find it in the list of open bugs. You'll find it in the list of closed bugs normally. And normally, there's someone on there, and they normally seem to work for Google, who goes, why on earth would you ever want that? Closed bug. Yeah. This is anecdotal. I'm not here with a list of bug numbers for you to go in and see this for yourselves. But this is my experience and how I felt having gone into the Kubernetes bug tracker on GitHub on the issues list. Because they don't seem to understand how things we all take for granted when we're managing servers, they don't seem to understand why we'd want those in Kubernetes. They're not going, Kubernetes is, because of this, they're not there defending decisions and saying, well, Kubernetes works this way, this is how you do it. They're just saying, well, what is that? Never heard of it. Why would you have it? It's a real problem. Here's another example. Rolling restarts of services. If you can inject config files into containers with Kubernetes, something I've not shown you how to do. It's a very common thing. But your application often needs to be restarted to pick up those changed config files. Kubernetes has no support for restarting the application without destroying the pod and starting it again. This is not a feature in Kubernetes. You go into the bug tracker and ask, well, why? And again, you'll see people going, because Google write their software, so the configs are all dynamically loaded all the time. They're not loaded at startup like they are with most other software. Now, maybe I'm being harsh and Google just has blind spots like everyone else. But there is a Google bubble, and Kubernetes is slowly being dragged out of the Google bubble, and you need to be aware of it because these things eat a lot of time as you figure out. First of all, you figure out that's what the cause is, and then you figure out your own workarounds for it because Kubernetes doesn't give you the functionality out of the box. And as I said, it means a lot of third-party containers. In my experience, most of the ones I've been asked to get running on Kubernetes by my clients don't work out of the box. So it's a time sink. To date, I've managed to get everything I want working, but I've normally ended up building my own containers to work around the problem. So just be aware of that. Now, I did mention the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, the CNCF, earlier. And because it's been opened through the CNCF, you've got lots of people contributing and slowly evolving Kubernetes to suit a more general audience. I'm not here to discourage you from using Kubernetes. You absolutely can use it today. It is mature enough, it's reliable enough. It is a young project, but if you look back to, say, I'm going to use OpenStack as the big example. of a big open source infrastructure project that came out. In the early years of OpenStack, it was such a shit show. You couldn't even boot VMs on it half the time. I watched a company take 2 years to get it working on the platform. Kubernetes, year for year, is leaps and bounds ahead in terms of quality and actual usability. It's fantastic for that. But if you want to do it, you have to learn to adapt. You have got to learn the Kubernetes way, and you've got to embrace it, or it's not going to work for you.